Okay, we're going to get started. Thank you everyone for joining us for the second installment of our Southpac webinar series. We already had one very informative webinar that lots of people got a lot out of. So excited today to present a bit of a different topic on auditing. And we've got our Southpac CEO Andy Shone and founder of Auditor Training Co presenting on maturing the audit process. So Andy himself is a certified lead auditor, has run hundreds of audits for many organisations across different industries, and we've been an audit organisation for more than 20 years at Southpac. So Andy might provide a little bit more context about our history and where we've gotten to and why this topic has been of interest to him and is obviously of interest to all of you joining today. So thanks, Andy. Kick it off and we'll get started.
Thanks very much, Katie. And thanks everyone for joining us. It was great to go through the registrants list this morning and see so many familiar names across all different parts of the Southpac International Group client base, but also to see some new company names as well. So thanks for joining the Auditor Training Co webinar. It's the first webinar we've run under the Auditor Training Co name. And as Katie mentioned, audits are something which, as an organization, we've had a lot of interest in, but something I feel is really a great room for improvement in. I think many people would probably recognize the fact that audits is something we do a lot of, whether you're a quality, safety, or security professional, whichever part of the discipline you're coming from, you're probably aware that we do a lot of audits. But the question always hangs, how effective are those audits? So what I would like to just share with you first up is give you an outline of what we're going to talk about today. So we're going to talk a little bit about the audit challenge. There's not anything probably terribly new in there for you, although there is literature now that's been published which shows and demonstrates what some of those challenges are. We're going to introduce our audit maturity model, explain a little bit what that looks like and how that might be able to help you in your organization. We're also going to look a little bit at what maybe a new set of contemporary audit principles might look like. We're going to share a case study of what that looks like in practice and then open up to any questions that anyone may have. Equally, feel free to put any questions into the chat feed. I'll try and monitor those as we go along, but equally hold the questions to the end. Happy to answer questions at the end as well. So here's what we're going to talk about. Before we get into the actual substance, what do we know about auditing? Who are we to be running this webinar on maturing the audit process? Well, Southpac International Group, pretty much all of our constituent businesses that make up the group all have pretty either lesser or greater, most of them a greater involvement in auditing. Southpac Aerospace has been training aviation auditors for over 20 years, and we've been providing independent audits and second-party audits across the aviation industry for more or less 20 years as well. So I've personally been involved with a lot of audits and assessments in a lot of different aviation settings. So we have that aviation auditing experience. We have a certification body within our group, Southpac Certifications. We have hundreds of certified organizations out there who we audit and certify to various different management system standards. Southpac Plus is our technology solution, which includes internal audit functions for organizations' management systems. Auditor Training Co is a relatively new business in the group, where we're training auditors, and this maturity model is shortly to be rolled out as part of a new training course that we're offering through the Auditor Training Co. And HOP Lab, well, that's our business where we're helping organizations engage with HOP and new view approaches to safety. So people might think, well, what's the HOP and auditing got to do with each other? Well, I think we'll show today there is definitely room to incorporate more kind of progressive or new thinking into more traditional tools like audits. So that's a little bit about our group and our background and where we're coming out from an audit perspective. So I mentioned audit challenges. So what are some of the audit challenges? Well, what people would probably first think of when they think about audits is some of the challenges associated with each individual audit or an audit they maybe have been assigned to go and do. And they might think about when audits have been unsuccessful, they might think about, well, maybe there was a lack of preparation. We didn't thoroughly make sure we were familiar with the subject matter and the documentation, and it was all a bit disjointed. So maybe that was one thing. People often say, oh, well, management don't really support our audit program, or they're not really interested. So that derails or undermines the success of our audit program. Well, maybe that's true. Lack of cooperation on both sides. Maybe the auditor or the audit team don't want to cooperate or don't want to be flexible with the auditee, or maybe the auditee is not so interested in the audit and doesn't prioritize it. So that can undermine audit effectiveness. Poor attitudes both ways, and I've seen it happen both ways many times. Auditors who think they're pretty important and a pretty big deal, the Ron Burgundy effect going on, and auditee maybe equally not engaged, not interested, or very defensive. Sometimes there can be a lack of understanding on both sides about what their role is, what the audit is supposed to be achieving. Poor communication can get in the way. That's probably very, very common, where we're talking a different language and think we're communicating effectively, but not so. And then finally, lack of a technical expertise. That can certainly be the case, and I've even experienced that myself when I being involved in an audit and steered into an area where I thought, I really don't know anything about this area, to the point whereby it's actually becoming an issue, whereby how can I really verify or say one way or another whether this is what good looks like, because I don't know. So that can be an issue, lack of technical expertise. But these limitations, and these are probably ones that are all familiar with, these are all relevant, but they tend to be more relevant to a specific audit. But some of the challenges we're referring to aren't just about on an audit by audit basis. We're thinking about the entire, maybe the whole system of auditing. Now, there's been some recent research done by Ben Hutchinson, referenced the two papers there, which have both been released earlier this year. Would strongly recommend going and check those out, particularly if you have a strong interest in auditing, or you're an auditor. Ben has done some really great work here with these two papers, so full credit to Ben. Check out his website as well. There's some really useful information there. But summarizing the key findings from these two papers, Audit Masquerade particularly, they've researched and found some serious limitations in how we're approaching audits. So one of the first things they noticed is general superficial corrections over what might be called root causes or more systemic issues. Now, this is not going to be any great surprise. Anyone who's involved in auditing probably knows many auditors maybe have a penchant, or even the organization has a penchant for low-hanging fruit, or it was observed someone wasn't wearing PPE, or the paperwork hadn't been completed. That is almost a guarantee you're going to find it in almost every audit. So there's one issue. Failure to act on known issues. So that's identifying problems. It's in audit reports, but then nothing's done about it, or only very superficial actions are put in place. The third one, I think, is a absolute perennial problem, not just in audits, but in all quality and safety efforts. An overemphasis on compliance and paperwork. Now, I'm going to come to that word compliance shortly, because I don't see compliance as being a dirty word. There is nothing wrong with ensuring compliance, but if it's compliance only, and especially if it's focused on a surface level of paperwork, then we run into problems. So this is very much aligned with Greg Smith's perspective with Paper Safe, his book, where we can become very focused on the bureaucratization and almost the triviality of safety or quality, rather than going deeper. Another thing sometimes, and this maybe relates to the lack of technical expertise, we can misinterpret the actual threat. So one example Ben talks to is an issue which is written up in an audit as a housekeeping issue. So there was combustible dust build up in a particular warehouse facility, but this is raised as a housekeeping issue. Well, who's going to really prioritize a housekeeping issue? That's not really seen as being that important. But then when you have an explosion and that combustible dust is part of the accident, all of a sudden that misdiagnosed problem becomes very significant. Actually, that wasn't a housekeeping issue at all. It was actually a very significant hazard, but potentially through a lack of awareness or lack of knowledge or competence, that was missed. I think that the fourth point, or fifth point here, lack of focus on operational realities, is really important. For those who are familiar with the term safety work versus the safety of work, you may be kind of familiar with this idea as safety professionals, and same for pretty much all of the professionals too, quality, security, environment. we can exist in our own world, which is very much focused on paperwork and systems and things that are important to us, but they're not really that important to the person at the front line. Or even the supervisor or the manager closer to the front line and say, well, yeah, that's stuff I get that you're fascinated with it and it's really interesting and important to you, but it doesn't really help me run my operation. It doesn't really help me get the process done. It's just something else that I have to do. So this is a problem which, again, relates to that overemphasis on compliance and paperwork. Auditing isn't necessarily seen as being a help or an improvement tool if it's just focused on things that don't seem to be very relevant to most of the operation. And then also we can have ambiguity in audit goals and scope. So what is it that we're actually supposed to be trying to do and achieve with an audit? So is it supposed to be a risk management tool or is it supposed to be a nitpicking tool? So these are some of the challenges that we see in auditing. And I think we really need to try and work on some of these challenges, because otherwise we're missing a tremendous opportunity. We invest a huge amount of time and effort and money in doing audits. So what can we do to ensure we get maximum return on that time? So I think one aspect is the actual definitions and what we're talking about with audits is very limiting. If you look at the ISO definition here of an audit, it mentions a systematic, independent, and documented process for obtaining objective evidence and evaluating it objectively to determine the extent to which audit criteria are fulfilled. Well, I find that in some respects very limiting. And also this kind of absolute obsession with objective. Well, let's face it, auditors are people working in a people-focused system most of the time. How objective can we ever really be? So we can try and be independent and we can be as objective as we can, but there's always going to be subjectivity that comes into the audit approach in any case. So I think that's one thing, is how are we defining an audit? One of the things we'll talk about in a moment when we introduce the audit maturity model is, of course, there are different types of audits. We have internal audits, we have supplier audits, and we have various different types of third-party audits. And some of these different audit types will lend themselves to particular approaches more than others. So we run a certification body, as I've mentioned. It's very difficult for a certification body to do really very much beyond ensuring that a system is compliant and is in place and actually implemented. It's not a certification body's job to tell a client or tell an organization, no, you should be doing it this way, or have you considered that? There is a certain amount of, I guess, free advice, you could say, that a certification auditor can provide, but it's not really their role. And it's similar for a regulator. You can't tell the organization what they should be doing, or they shouldn't be telling them this is how it should be done. They should be helping them to achieve the outcome or understand what the outcome might look like, but it's not their job to tell them what to do. So, but nevertheless, I think all of these audit types can definitely benefit from stretching our thinking a little bit, stretching the trying to push the envelope a little bit around what it is we're doing with audits. So, and that's whether it's a whole system audit, process audit, or very specific product audit or inspection. So here's our audit maturity model. A few things to say right from the outset around the audit maturity model. This is not a kind of saying one end of the maturity model is great, the other end of the maturity model is bad. All parts of the maturity model have their place. That's the first thing to say. So it's not saying if you're only at one end, well, that's wrong. It's about matching the appropriate parts of the model to need. So we mentioned that context is important. Nuance really matters. And I think one of the problems we struggle from in all walks of life these days is an inability to consider nuance and complex things and say, well, yeah, in this situation, this is helpful. In this situation, it's not. We tend to prefer, no, that's just bad. Audits are useless. Don't do them. Compliance is bad. Don't focus on it. Well, it's not really very helpful. We need compliance, and I think audits can be a very useful tool and probably should be more helpful than they are. Secondly, compliance, and I've mentioned this already, compliance is not a dirty word. In some particular parts of safety, particularly in very new view focused organizations, compliance is almost seen as it's, why would we be focused on compliance? Well, A, it's an obligation. oftentimes we don't have a choice. We have to comply, and oftentimes the regulations are very well intended. The interesting thing is when we talk about compliance, most of the time, the issues with compliance don't tend not to be with regulatory requirements, which oftentimes are quite sensible, actually. It tends to be with internal requirements and internal rules and internal structures we put in place that create more of an issue. So most audit approaches have a time and a place. So some audit situations lend themselves more to a particular approach than others. So that's just some things to set the ground before we move into the actual model itself. So what's the base level of our maturity model? Well, I think the base of any system and any insurance program should be first and foremost compliance. And audits traditionally have been very focused on compliance, and probably rightly so. But within compliance, there are grades or levels of effectiveness, or you could say how useful this is. So at the very base of compliance, well, we have superficial compliance. So we can have entire audits that are focused very much on, do our documents meet the standard? Or do our documents meet the regulatory requirement? And whether you're in an airline setting where many hundreds of hours are spent, probably more, on writing and improving and monitoring manuals, that is almost at that end here. That's pretty much superficial compliance, i.e. we have documentation which matches the requirements. And that probably exists across many different industries too. Whether you're in a small organization or an SME or a manufacturing, whether maybe you have a requirement, you have to get the various ISO standards in place, 9001, 45001, 40001, whatever it might be. Well, the first thing that tends to happen is lots of documents are created. We end up with a large library we have all of these great documents, and oftentimes they can look really slick, and we've got this great system. But that's, again, still superficial. In the truest meanings of the words, in terms of it's only on the surface. Where compliance becomes really important is not on the superficial side, although we need that. Oftentimes we need that to get a ticket to operate. Where it becomes more useful to us is that deep compliance. So what's deep compliance? Well, it's where the actual intent behind a protocol, a procedure, or a regulation is met in practice, not just on paper. So you have all the great systems. It's important to check that you have on paper anyway. Check you have all the documentation, you know what you're doing, you're fulfilling and meeting your requirements. Really critical question then is, are you doing it? You tell me in this policy, or this procedure, in this guide, this is what we do. Okay, let's see it. Is it actually in place? Is it working? And is it working piece is where we start transitioning from just being purely about compliance more to assessment. Now, as soon as you come to assessment, inevitably our limiting definition from audit, which is an objective process, assessment almost immediately becomes more subjective. Because how do we decide whether a system is effective or not? Well, you have to go and view it. You have to, yes, gather evidence, but talk to people and try and gain understanding. Is this really working? So what does this look like? Well, there's probably lots of examples you can go out there in industry and look at for what an assessment looks like. But what I just picked up here is from CASA, the Civil Aviation Safety Authority, who put this tool in place in line with many other aviation regulators globally. This is their safety management systems evaluation tool and the associated guidance. So I just picked that up and just dropped that straight in there. So full credit to CASA on that. And in the introduction comments, it makes this following comment: this concept of evaluating SMS effectiveness supports the move from traditional compliance-based oversight to performance-based oversight that focuses on how the SMS is performing. So there's a compliance aspect in there right from the outset. Okay, do you have a safety management system in place? Are all of the elements documented in your system? Do you comply with the initial intent or requirements in your documentation? But that's not enough. You have to then go beyond that and say, well, okay, yes, as you can see on this little guide on the top for the indicator 2.2.1 around risk management mitigation processes. Well, first step is it present? Well, Yeah, they have it. It's documented. It's written down. Okay. Is it suitable to the organization? Is this a very large airline, or is it like one-man band operation? Third element, okay, this is really getting into the assessment now. Is it operating? It's one thing to have it documented, and it might also be applicable for the size of the organization, but is it actually being done? Have we got evidence to see it? And then the most important aspect really is it effective? Is it working? Is it working for the organization? And that's where it becomes probably most subjective, because one person's idea of effective might be quite different to another person's idea of effective. So assessment is really pushing us beyond, is it just superficially compliant? But there is definitely a link here, as you'll probably observe, between deep compliance and then assessment. Once we're getting into the really high end of assessment, though, is it effective? Is it working? That really is starting to, you can say that's leading towards where are the pain points. That really is opening the door to lead to then the next step, which would be operational learning. Really getting a greater understanding of the operational challenges, exploring work as imagined, work as done, and acting really as an organizational intelligence tool. That's especially the case in internal audit programs. Harder to move into this phase, but probably maybe as a regulator or as a certification body, or even potentially in the supply chain arrangements. Although not always the case, depends on your relationship with your suppliers. But certainly in an internal setting, this is where we really need to be pushing towards is, okay, compliance, yeah, that's important, but let's face it, ChatGPT or other similar tools are probably going to be doing a lot of that type of work for us in the future. So does it meet the requirement or not? Well, that's a quick job through ChatGPT. Deep compliance into assessment, that's important, but then leading from there into operational learning. So what is operational learning? Just so we're clear on definitions. So it mentions here, operational learning is about understanding the work from the perspective of the worker. Or as another speaker, a HOP speaker I saw recently said, Brad Mayhew, I was at a conference in Canada, he said, operational learning is learning about our operations. So can't say it simpler than that. But we could say that the real shift is going from operator compliance to operator struggle. And they are very different conversations. So imagine this work crew on site here, and an auditor turns up in their brand new PPE with a really shiny high-vis jacket and brand new steel cap boots. And if they're having a very compliance-focused conversation, you can imagine how that conversation goes. Well, it's probably not even a conversation. It's probably going to be questions and yes, no answers. Have you signed on to the safe work method statement today? Can I see it? Can I verify that everyone has actually signed it? Yes, okay. Well, they're compliant. But have we really learned anything? Have we verified whether the tool itself is effective? Have we figured out if the controls are necessarily effective? Maybe we might ask questions about the controls, but it's very unlikely that approach is going to ask, hey, tell me about what's going on in the work. What is it you rely on to be successful while you're doing this? What are the things that you worry about? That's quite a different conversation. That's focused on operator struggle rather than operator compliance. Another thing which I think is really critical to convey at this stage when we're talking about operational learning is this concept of work as imagined versus work as done, because this is a real challenge for auditors. So every organization has a work as imagined. So that's our black line. That's our policies and procedures and guidelines, that, you know, all the management system elements we have in place. We all have a work as imagined. Every organization in the world also has a work as done. This squiggly, annoying blue line, which is kind of like sometimes it's maybe on the line, but more often than not, it's kind of above or below. And audits and the blue line don't tend to go together real well. It's like, well, oftentimes they're just seen as non-compliances or non-conformances times when these things don't match up. And they might just get written up as such. But what audits need to do to really move into that next phase of effectiveness is not be so worried about the gap, is more interested in the context around the gap. Now, an audit assurance program almost by definition wants to try and close that gap. But before you do that, we really need to seek to understand, seek to learn, explore, and dive into that context. So there's our 3 stages of the audit maturity model. So we're thinking about compliance, then to assessment, and an operational learning. And it's not that any one part of it is better or more important, but it's about where we can, how do we move up the scale of our audits, and how do we try and but most appropriately match the type of audit we're doing to the situation and to the context. So that's thinking more around the kind of the system that we're using, how we're approaching audits. But I think it's also worth thinking about the individuals who are doing the audits too. Because I think it's not just enough to put new tools or encourage a different approach. We also need to think about what are the guiding principles for auditors. So here's from the audit principles from ISO 19011. You know you're on an audit webinar when there's lots of ISO references being made, right? So here's the 7 principles: integrity, fair presentation, due professional care, confidentiality, independence, taking an evidence-based approach, a risk-based approach. I think all of these things are probably eminently sensible and should still be required from our auditors, whether they're internal or external auditors. No one wants to see an auditor that doesn't have integrity or doesn't fairly represent what's been found or discussed in an audit situation. We want people who are taking suitable care. So you'd say our professionals, they have to deal with information confidentially. They have to try and have a degree of independence and make decisions based on evidence and consider risk and where they're best to serve their efforts. It's also a really critical question when you talk to auditors about the so what question. So you found something during your audit, but the next question should always be, well, so what? What would be the worst case scenario if this isn't addressed? What's this deficiency or apparent deficiency potentially going to lead to? So I think those things are all fine, but again, I don't think they're really sufficient, especially if we want to move up the maturity scale, particularly into this higher end level of assessment and operational learning. So here's some other principles I would like to propose as being really useful principles for auditors. So humility, not necessarily something always associated with auditors. Curiosity, some auditors are really curious, some maybe not so much. And then also a focus on learning. So what do we mean by these three principles in practice in an audit setting? Well, I really like Edgar Schein's work on humble inquiry and humble leadership. So Edgar Schein, when talking about humble inquiry, makes this comment, he says, humble inquiry is the fine art of drawing someone out, of asking questions to which you do not already know the answer, of building a relationship based on curiosity and interest in the other person. I would really love to be able to do a poll right now and ask how many people have been involved in an audit where they've seen genuine humble inquiry take place. Especially when you consider that particular aspect, asking questions to which you do not already know the answer. Now, I'd probably wager a little bit of money here that a lot of auditors ask questions believing they already know the answer, and they're just looking to verify that that person they're asking knows the answer. And sometimes you'll see this whole charade go on in an audit situation where the auditor asks the question, the auditee kind of scrambles for the answer, and maybe the supervisor's there nodding them along and helping them out, give the right answer. And the auditor then maybe accepts that and goes, oh, they seem to know the right thing. I think that situation's far less likely to come about if we're genuinely interested. If we have that humility and don't think, I'm the auditor, I know everything. But think, well, I'm really interested to know what this person knows. I'm really interested to try and get an understanding of their perspective of the work, what's important to them. And that ties, I think, really nicely to the second principle of curiosity. We make curiosity into a genuine, open-minded interest in understanding the perspectives, thoughts, and feelings of others. So some people might go, oh, feelings, what do we need to do? We don't need to know about feelings. We're auditors, we don't have feelings. So maybe discount the feelings part. We're not there to explore feelings necessarily in an audit, but I'm really very interested in the thoughts and perspectives of people and the insights of the people who are doing the work. Because one of the things that auditors should absolutely know and understand and appreciate and show that through their actions is the person they're talking to is there every single day. They do the job every day. They are an expert in the field of how that job is being done. So we should approach that person with the appropriate sort of, I guess, humility and acknowledgement that a person I'm talking to knows more about this than me. And if we approach that conversation in that way, that's going to demonstrate humility and naturally lead to more curiosity. So an auditor who says things like, that's really interesting. Can you tell me more about that? Can you show me an example of where that's happened? Can you come and show me that right now? Let's go and have a look at that. You've just told me a story of it. Can you show me what that looks like in the workshop or in the plant or out there on the flight line, wherever the setting might be? That's I think a better approach and leads to learning. So I would love if I could just take these 3 principles and drop them into every auditor. I think we could be making massive inroads and improvements in how effective our audits are. So what do we mean by learning? Well, I like this definition. A learning mindset is an attitude or approach characterized by openness to acquiring new knowledge, skills, and perspectives. It involves curiosity, adaptability, and a willingness to embrace challenges or feedback as opportunities for growth rather than obstacles. So maybe not all of that definition is strictly applicable to an audit, but I like this idea of being open to acquiring new knowledge and skills and being open to different perspectives. You'll see how all 3 of these things, the curiosity and the humility and the learning, they all tie together really. One supports the other, and by doing one, you're kind of sort of doing the other and reinforcing the other and so on. So I've heard auditors say, I see my role as an auditor to be an educator. And I think that can be really helpful in some situations, because sometimes an organization or an individual or a manager doesn't really understand what's required. So that can be helpful to be an educator. If a regulator can say, hey, here's what the regulation means or what it requires. So rather than just using this as an opportunity to kind of like the client or the organization to try and help them improve, I think there's a role for that, kind of being an educator. But I think it's more important for an auditor to be a learner than an educator, because that changes the kind of the dynamic in the relationship. An educator almost inevitably is going to be superior to the educated, whereas a learner is seeing, well, the person I'm learning from it kind of instills this humility into the situation. So I think these principles going hand in hand with the approach are really important. So how does this play out when we go into our real life situation and we're exploring work as imagined versus work as done when we're doing an audit? Well, inevitably, when we go along, we say, oh, here, these gaps, found these gaps between work as imagined and work as done. Well, a traditional audit kind of goes like this. It goes, especially that last one, that's a major. So we get, okay, we found all these gaps. Let's write it up. Great success. We've done a good audit. We can go away. We leave a bunch of actions with the relative manager, and we've done a good job. Well, I don't think that's doing a good job. just saying. So I think really, rather than being interested in compliance alone, I think we need to be interested in exploring work as imagined versus work as done. So here's our start again. Here's our black line. Here's our blue line, which we're discovering and exploring as we go out into the field. When we identify these gaps, or the kind of questions maybe we ask can identify the gaps, we ask questions more like, tell me about your work. What is it you do here? We might ask questions like, what does a good day look like for this task or for this process or this part of the system? A question like, what does a good day look like, and open up untold possibilities and so many conversations around, well, good day is when this happens and this happens and we have this equipment available and this person's on shift. Oh, really? That's interesting. So why is it important to you that that person's on shift? Oh, they actually got a lot of knowledge and know-how that no one else has. And when they're here, it's actually, everything runs much smoother. That's interesting. That's operational learning. We've just uncovered a dependency on one particular key person. Oftentimes, the things we learn in those types of conversations are not things that exist anywhere in our systems, our formal systems. What does a bad day look like on this process? Oh, let me tell you, we had one just yesterday. Well, that's interesting because now the auditor is not just learning about the snapshot in time they're looking at while they're there. This can be uncovering issues that are not necessarily manifesting right at the time of audit, but are known or ongoing issues. Tell me about that bad day. Okay, yeah, bad day. What happened yesterday? Can you explain tell me the story of that? And just be using those principles, curiosity, humility, interest, not judging the person, being interested in their perspective. Yeah, that's really interesting. So I had a situation just recently with a client on site where someone came running over to me because they saw that I was on site and said, "Hey, you that auditor guy?" So, well, actually, no, I'm not here to do an audit. I am an auditor, but I'm not here to do an audit. I was there doing the learning team. But this guy had heard that this was an opportunity to kind of share their perspectives, and this guy came over and talked with me for about 20 minutes without almost taking a breath to tell me all these various different things that he thought, hey, you need to know this. This is all really good stuff. And as it worked out, it was stuff that other people had already told me, but it was still valuable, the fact that he felt he could tell me, and he was really passionate about sharing his perspective. Where is it easy to make a mistake? That's an interesting question for an auditor to ask. From any perspective, it's quality, safety, environment, whatever. What's the worst thing that can happen in this process or area? You might ask that in lots of different ways. What keeps you awake at night? If you were to hear there was an accident in this area, what would it be? So these questions are almost open-ended. They generate stories, they can create countless possibilities, but they create organizational learning. And what they do is they allow us to go in and explore that messy story of work. Most of us, especially those of us who have a background in systems and auditing, we want the world to be nice and neat and ordered. And we can do a reasonable job of that, where you get really good processes and procedures and systems in place. But the reality is there's always elements of work that are messy and not as per the system. And there are always going to be these other things going on in work, which, sometimes we have events, but the interesting thing is more often than not, we actually have success. And all of those same messy elements of the story are present when we're successful or we have an event. So in that respect, audits have the potential to be very, I guess, on point and new view, i.e. they're a tool we're using right now to go and learn from normal work. They're facing everyday operations, everyday work, the everyday running of processes and tasks and systems, seeking to, or should be seeking to understand how that system works, where potential weaknesses are and where we can improve. So tying all this together, I'll just share a brief case study of a safety management system audit of a HEMS operator I was involved in, lead auditor for a few years back. And this audit quite nicely cut across all three dimensions, I guess, of the maturity model. So there's a HEMS operator, I won't say who it was, so it's a helicopter emergency medical situation. They're based in a part of Australia. They have multiple bases around different parts of Australia. They'd recently been issued a new contract. So they had new machines that had come online, they had new bases, but lots of people have been with the organization a long time, and overall a good operator, mature systems in place, good people, competent people. But they were just interested in getting a second opinion, a second outside view, an assessment done of their safety management system, which straight away you feel is like that's a reasonable good indication that this is a well-run operation where they're interested. They don't have to do it, but they're interested in an outside assessment of their safety management system. So here's how this kind of cut across the various different parts of the model. So in terms of compliance, well, first job as a lead auditor, well, do they have a compliant safety management system in place? And I mean, just very much at a superficial level. Can we have your documentation? Can we review that? Let's start using the CASA SMS assessment tool. Let's go through, make sure all the appropriate elements are in place. That can be done way ahead of the audit. And now, as I've already mentioned, that's the kind of thing where AI is going to be very helpful as a productivity tool for auditors. That's going to be able to, in time, be able to do all that for us and say, yes, all the various different requirements are in this document or in this suite of documents even. Here's maybe some things to question. So that's the first thing. So yes, they had a compliant set of manuals and documents. All the things you'd expect to see were in place. Then you start thinking about, okay, well, what about deep compliance? They have all the documentation. Are they really doing it? Is it effective? So that's when we start to lead into assessment. So that and naturally is done on site through looking for records, speaking to key people, carrying out that kind of how does it feel? What does it look like? Can you tell me this? Can you show me that? Can you tell me a story of? And you start to get a feeling for, okay, they've got some pretty decent systems in place. They've got the evidence they're showing kind of backs up they're doing the things that they say they're doing. But then you say, okay, well, everything from the head office perspective seems great. Let's go to an operational site. And we'll do some more interviews, which is still kind of very much in the assessment phase, verifying and assessing and assuring that the systems that you have in place, at least at a head office level, are actually active at an operational site. And here's when things start to get interesting, because the closer you are to the work, the more opportunity there is then to do this more operational learning perspective. So one of the things that I noticed was the beautiful facilities, brand new, very competent people, brand new machines out there on the heli deck ready to go. So the facilities that have been built there considered everything. There was obviously it's 24-hour operation, so overnight facilities, really good briefing rooms, technology, everything's been considered. You think people who are working here must be pretty happy. This is a state-of-the-art facility. But then you start talking to the crew who are on duty, waiting for a call to come through, and something doesn't seem just quite right. So at the point where my guide leaves the room, I close the door, say, listen, I'm just really curious. Like, I'm seeing all these great things, new helicopter, you've got beautiful facilities, everything that opens and shuts, but I'm not really feeling the love. What's going on? And one of the crew, or the four-person crew, so you've got a doctor, a paramedic, a crewman, and pilot from memory. One of that four turns around and says, how would you feel if every time you went to work, you were being recorded? And I said, oh, that's a kind of a good question. I never really thought about that before, but I imagine it can probably put you on edge to some point. He said, yeah, well, with these new aircraft and the contract that we have, we are required to have a camera, one on the flight deck, one facing into the cabin, and one over the winch. Everything we do is recorded, but we have no access to that. And we never hear anything about this apart from when someone makes a mistake. And then we get a call from XYZ position in the organization, and they want to bring us into the office and say, when you were doing this and this, you didn't do that correct. So unsurprisingly, this starts to feel like kind of like Big Brother. We're out in like a live operating environment, sometimes in quite risky situations, dealing with a lot of pressure, dealing oftentimes about the nature of their work. They're dealing with situations which are urgent, serious, maybe sometimes critical in nature. And it's at the back of your mind thinking, I'm being recorded. Everything I'm doing is being watched. Now, I felt this was a concern for a number of different reasons, but I thought, well, this will be interesting. Take it back to when we get back to head office, I'll raise the question. Now, the interesting thing, the senior leadership team, when I spoke to them, had absolutely no awareness of the fact that this was an issue. They were aware that the CCTV cameras were in place. They didn't have any understanding that how it was being managed, who had access to the tape, the fact that it was being used as a performance management tool. And then one of them made an interesting comment. Goes, you know what? That's really interesting. You've mentioned that now. Something I heard makes a lot more sense. I was watching a video just recently of an operation, and it was one of the things that one of the crew said was, don't screw it up. Remember, we're on camera. And all of a sudden that starts to make more sense once you realize some of this other stuff which is going on in the background. So where this links back now, this is an issue to as far as the crew are concerned. Should I now be concerned about the overall effectiveness of the SMS? So this is where this operational learning, which is really deeper level learning and really looking at effectiveness. If the SMS was really truly effective, the policy was being lived by, if the protocols and reporting processes all worked, if we had that as an aviation, we talk about a just culture, where we have openness and fairness and so on, a reporting culture, surely this would be something that could be aerated and be discussed and so on. So operational learning really adds to the overall assessment. Doesn't replace it, but it really allows us to go deeper and exploring that kind of work as done, which then either validates and verifies our assessment or allows us to get a deeper understanding of what's really going on. So that's a little bit about the audit maturity model. It's a little bit about some new principles for auditing. Appreciate it's been a very quick fly through. Does anyone have any questions in relation to any of the things that have been discussed today?
Andy, there's a comment from Russell Ohms, who's very well known to Southpac, in the
Hi,
chat.
Russell.
MOC identification in the process.
Management change. Well, exactly. This is a good opportunity to verify and assess how effective is our management change process. This is and of course, with that kind of change, they've introduced a new fleet of helicopters, gone from a kind of a previous generation to a new generation. So massive management of change going on. But there are always going to be things that get missed, and things may be considered from a technical perspective, but are they thought about from a non-technical perspective? So, okay, we have to have CCTV cameras fitted in the aircraft. All these aircraft have them fitted as standard now. What's the technical consideration is, okay, how do we maintain that? What do we do with the tape? How do we manage the data? All that kind of stuff. The non-technical stuff is, how do our crews feel about being recorded while they're at work? How are we gonna, what are some of the things, protections we have to put in place around the data? So in that particular instance, I said to the crew as part of that conversation, how would you feel about being recorded at work if the first people who saw the tape after each mission was the crew who flew the mission? And you use that as like a means to kind of learn, review a performance. And they were like, we would love that. We'd actually then see it as a useful thing. The fact that we never see the tape unless someone makes a mistake and then it gets shown to us by someone else in the management structure, that was a totally different situation. So I'm going to just read that question. I'm not sure if you're any advice provide recommendations in a style that is accepted by management based on the nuances of the effectiveness performance-based process. Yeah, so that's one of the things I kind of denied about whether including or not in this webinar. One of the things I think is a real limitation to audits is when the auditor feels they need to provide the solution or the answer. I think the term you use there, recommendation, is definitely better than corrective action. I think the auditor's role really is just to identify the issue. It's over then to the operation, to the organization, to then figure out, okay, you've identified the issue. We need to kind of dig in a bit deeper and figure out what's really going on and put in place an appropriate action plan. So yeah, that's where I would be leading towards. Same as an investigation. It's not the investigator's job to tell the person what the fixes should be. So they say, well, these are the contributing factors and these are the underlying issues, and then you need to put something in place. Recommendations in some instances may be totally fine, but again, it's a recommendation rather than you will do this. So I'm noticing a couple of comments coming from here saying this is in line with where they're going. So that's really good to hear. Jenny's just asked a question here. What about a similar approach of the hierarchy versus the front line? That's an interesting question. And I think what tends to happen is the further up the hierarchy you tend to be, the more focused it's going to be on more things like compliance, really, or to some extent, some assessment. But there's the closer we get to where the operation is, where the risk is, where quality and safety is made or broke every day, that's where we're going to have more opportunity to explore through an operational learning approach and really get those deeper insights. All right, well, I think everyone's more or less asked any questions. People can feel free to ask any others. One of the final things I was going to mention was if you're interested in learning more about what this looks like in practice, you can check out Auditor Training Co. We are launching a new course on advanced audit practice, one-day course. which is going to put together the model, the audit maturity model, and these new auditor principles, and show how you can use that in practice, both at an organizational level, so that things like templates, processes, procedures, but also then how you do it. I demonstrated what those better questions might look like in practice in an audit situation.
We'll have that up soon. I'm going to attempt to speak, even though it said my internet connection was shaky. Justin's thrown a couple more questions in, and you might have to call Justin afterwards and have a chat. Not sure how much time. We've got a couple of minutes left. Did you want to answer Justin's
Sure.
question?
Yeah, I'm happy to answer any of the questions. Yeah.
Does this approach shift emphasis to workplace observation versus document review?
Good question. I think that I'm always very wary of the word observation, because that feels kind of like I'm standing back, observing and watching. And most people don't really like to be observed and watched while they're working. Now, I'd much rather be shoulder to shoulder with the person and say, can you show me how you would do this? You know, if I was to be here doing it, can you show me that? That feels a lot more collaborative than the traditional, here comes the, as they call it in mine, the shiny bums who have turned up from head office. I'm going to stand and observe. It's like I'm watching in judgment to find out whether you're doing it right or wrong. Am I going to observe any safe or unsafe behaviors? I know what you mean by using that term, but I think we'd much rather be taking that collaborative approach and exploring. Show me what it looks like. Help me understand. If I was to do this, could you show me what that would look like if I was doing that task right now? But it's horses for courses. That doesn't really work in a head office environment. In a head office environment, it's more focused on the compliance aspect. Can you show me the examples and the records that have been completed for that? So yeah, it really is a horses for courses. I think we need both.
There's a couple more, Andy. There is one from Adrian. I just want to head back up the chat a little way, from Adrian Niebling, who is a client of ours through Southpac certifications. And he had a great question. Do you see this as the way forward for third-party auditing or internal auditing?
I think primarily internal auditing, and to a lesser extent, it depends on your relationship you have with your suppliers. There potentially is a very collaborative relationship that can be had there. I think for regulators and for certification bodies, it's a bit harder to move into that operational learning space. But I think it is essential that they are operating in the assessment space. As CASA mentioned in their own documentation there, we're not just interested in compliance, we're interested in effectiveness and performance. So the outcomes-based legislation we have, not just in SMS, but across a whole range of different parts of aviation, it's important to be looking at effectiveness. So that requires assessment, not just does it comply, does it not? So it's moving towards that from just superficial surface level compliance, which is not going to save anybody's life or improve the quality of any product if it only exists on a document but isn't being done anywhere. So it's moving absolutely to the deep level compliance and an assessment of effectiveness.
There's a question in the, thanks Adrian, there's a question in the Q&A too, Andy, that I've just seen from Andy Raymer. I like his wording. Having noodled on similar ideas, would it not also be useful to tag successes and ask how the SMS sustained this?
Yeah, that would be interesting for sure, but I'm not sure how you do that in an audit situation. But certainly want to explore.
One more. I might have one more quick one from Toby. I can see there's a and it's a good one. There is a difference between internal auditing and the way that is often done in organizations. A copy of third-party or supplier audits. Do you think the distinction is well understood in the community?
Hi, Toby. I think it's a pretty mixed bag, to be honest with you. And I think that is one of these problems on some organizations, that people who get to do audits, it's almost like, oh yeah, you can do that. Just go and do that internal audit without really much training, preparation, understanding. So I think that's setting people up to fail, to be honest with you, if that's the approach. So I think, yeah, we need to set people up for success. But I think in an internal audit setting, we have a lot of latitude around how we're going to do audits. It's really well within our circle of control how we're going to do that. So we have, carte blanche really in terms of, to a certain extent, where we want to focus our efforts. And I think you probably need to be doing a certain amount of activity which is at that deep compliance level. But I'd be very much encouraging organizations to do a lot more in the way of assessment and moving into operational learning type audits, which is where the real gold is going to be, and it's going to help us with our problem of paper safe, paper audits, paper findings, paper solutions. Well, I think that's about a wrap, Katie.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, everyone. We've still got comments and thank you messages and things going coming through the chat. I will reiterate again, yes, we will be sending the recording of the webinar around, so keep an eye on your inbox, hopefully later today or early tomorrow for the recording. And yes, we are happy for people to circulate that to their work colleagues or anyone else in their organisation that they feel needs to hear this message. We certainly don't want to keep it quiet, and we encourage more and more people to be looking towards this approach and moving towards it. So yeah, thank you everyone, and we're going to wrap it there, and we hope to see you online for one of our future webinars as well.
Thanks everybody. See you next time.